What if one of the most familiar stories in European history was never really true? Not a small mistake, not a disputed footnote, a structural error, a false sense of continuity repeated for generations, until it hardened into common sense that the people of Europe simply became more European, over time changing slowly locally, almost organically from Ice Age hunters to farmers, to the nations that would later claim deep roots in the same soil. It was a comforting story. It made the map feel stable. It suggested inheritance without rupture, a continent growing out of itself. And for a long time that was close enough to the story scholars told. Archaeology could trace tools, pottery graves, house forms. Language scholars could propose migrations, but they could not see bodies move. Historians inherited a habit of continuity because continuity is what the evidence seemed to allow. If farming appeared in Europe, perhaps ideas traveled. If burial customs changed, perhaps neighbors copied neighbors. The people many assumed mostly stayed. Then the dead began to answer for themselves. In the 2000 Dias, Ancient DNA changed the field with a force that is still difficult to overstate. Not because it added another theory, but because it bypassed theory. It took skeletons buried thousands of years apart, extracted genetic material from bone and tooth, and compared those sequences directly to one another and to living populations. Suddenly, prehistory was no longer being reconstructed from objects alone. It was being read from bloodlines that had gone silent for millennia. And the first result was not a refinement. It was a rupture. The earliest Europeans after the last ice age were hunter-gatherers scattered across forests, river valleys, and coast, descendants of the first modern humans who entered Europe tens of thousands of years earlier. For years, they were treated as Europe's deep ancestral baseline, the beginning of the story that led in some uninterrupted way to the present. But when genomes from those hunter-gatherers were compared with the DNA of the first farming communities in Europe, something felt wrong. The difference was too large, too clean. These were not simply local foragers who had learned to plant wheat and keep cattle. They were, to a striking degree, different people. The farmers who spread across Europe around 8,000 years ago did not emerge from European hunter-gatherer populations. They came largely from Anatolia and the Near East. They carried agriculture with them, but they also carried themselves. Their ancestry moved with their seeds, their animals, their pottery, their settlements. And in much of Europe, they did not just join the old population. They replaced most of it. That is the first crack in the old story. Because once that becomes clear, Europe no longer looks like a civilization growing in place. It begins to look like a landscape repeatedly overwritten by incoming populations, powerful enough to transform the continent at the level that matters most, not only culture, but ancestry. And then the second crack appears. If the first farmers were already newcomers, then the question becomes unsettlingly simple. Were they at least the main ancestors of modern Europeans? For a moment, it seemed possible. Farming spreads, villages grow, monuments rise. The old hunters fade into the margins. A new Europe appears to take shape. But ancient DNA kept widening the sample. More graves, more regions, more centuries. And the genomes began to show another discontinuity later, and in some ways, even more violent. The farmers, it turned out, were not the end of the story. They were only the middle layer. Around 5,000 years ago, a new ancestry entered Europe from the east, out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas. These were mobile herders associated with what archaeologists call the Yamnaya horizon. They buried their dead beneath earthen mounds. They moved with livestock. They mastered a world of distant speed and open land. For more than a century, scholars argued over whether steppe peoples had mattered at all. Some linked them to the spread of Indo-European languages. Others were skeptical. The evidence was indirect. Pottery could travel without people. Languages could spread without conquest. The question remained open because the bones themselves had not yet spoken clearly enough. Then the DNA arrived. When researchers began sequencing ancient individuals from the late Neolithic and Bronze Age, especially from cultures like corded ware in Central and Northern Europe, the pattern was unmistakable. These people were not simply descended from Europe's first farmers. A massive new ancestry had appeared, and it matched the steppe. In some regions, the shift was so large it could not be explained by trade prestige or a slow trickle of intermarriage. It looked like migration on a continental scale. This is the moment the old image of Europe begins to collapse, because now the sequence is no longer one people gradually becoming another through peaceful change. First, hunter-gatherers are largely replaced by incoming farmers from Anatolia. Then, thousands of years later, many of those farming populations are themselves heavily transformed by steppe pastoralists moving west. Not once, but twice, the genetic structure of Europe changes dramatically. And not over some immeasurable prehistoric blur, but within a relatively short span of millennia. The implication is severe. Modern Europeans are not the product of one ancient population deepening in place. They are in broad terms a mixture of three very different ancestral groups: Western hunter-gatherers, Anatolian farmers, and steppe herders. Three layers, three migrations, three Europes stacked inside the present one. And the balance between them is not abstract. It still shapes the continent. In Southern Europe, ancestry linked to early Anatolian farmers remains especially strong. In places like Sardinia, that early farming signal survives with unusual clarity, almost like a preserved fragment of the Neolithic world. In Northern and Northeastern Europe, steppe ancestry rises sharply. Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, once nearly erased in places, persists at lower but significant levels across the continent, often more visible in the north and east than the south. This is not a story about pure origins. It is the opposite. It is the destruction of purity as a historical concept. There is no untouched European core waiting behind history. No single primordial people from whom all others simply branched. The deeper science digs, the less stable those fantasies become. Europe, one of the most mythologized identities in history, turns out to be the product of repeated mixture migration, replacement, and absorption. And then comes the detail that makes the discovery harder to contain. The steppe migration does not seem to have changed Europe evenly. In some places, the transformation appears strongly male-biased. Paternal lineages shift with startling force. Older Y chromosome lines diminish. New ones, especially those associated with Ere Uno A and Ere Uno B, expand across large parts of the continent. Something more than coexistence may have been happening. Not just movement, not just exchange, a reordering. And once that possibility enters the frame, the mystery becomes darker, because ancient DNA is no longer simply telling us who arrived. It is beginning to suggest how history may have been made. Ancient DNA can identify movement. It can measure mixture. It can reveal replacement. What it cannot do by itself is tell us exactly what it felt like when one world gave way to another. But sometimes the pattern is so extreme that the silence around it becomes its own kind of evidence. Across parts of Bronze Age Europe, the shift was not only broad, it was uneven in a way that points toward power. Maternal lines often show more continuity. Paternal lines in some regions change with startling speed. In Iberia, for example, ancient DNA indicates that by around 2000 antes de Cristo, about 40% of overall ancestry had been replaced, while nearly all earlier Guion chromosome lineages were displaced by newcomers carrying steppe-related ancestry. That is not a gentle cultural transition. It suggests a social order being remade from the top down, family by family, male line by male line. The old language of prehistory suddenly starts to sound inadequate. Interaction, exchange, diffusion. These words still matter, but they are no longer enough. Because the genetic record is not describing ideas drifting across a map. It is describing people arriving in numbers large enough to alter who would exist in the future, and in some cases, who would not. And this is where the story turns from demographic to civilizational. For more than a century, one of the deepest arguments in Eurasian history concerned the Indo-European languages, the enormous language family that includes English, German, Greek, Latin, the Celtic languages, the Slavic languages, and far beyond Europe, Sanskrit, and many others. Where had that linguistic system come from? How had it spread so widely? For generations, the debate remained unresolved, because language leaves no skeleton behind. Then ancient DNA changed the terms of the argument. The steppe migration detected in the genomes appears at roughly the right time, in the right direction, and on the right scale to support a steppe source for at least some of the Indo-European languages of Europe. It does not settle every branch or every root. Scholars still debate details, but the broad picture is now far harder to dismiss. A major language expansion may not have spread through Europe as a whisper of ideas. It may have ridden in, with a population movement powerful enough to reorder ancestry across the continent. That is the real reversal. Because once that possibility is accepted, the familiar foundations of Europe begin to look strangely recent. The languages later used for law, empire, scripture, philosophy, and nationhood may descend in large part from people who were themselves late arrivals. The first farmers were not the final Europeans. The hunter-gatherers were not the hidden pure core. Even the Bronze Age was not a stable inheritance. Each layer arrived after another layer had already claimed the land. And this does something unsettling to the very idea of origin. Nations often imagine ancestry as depth, something rooted, continuous, almost geological. But the deeper the science goes, the more Europe looks less like bedrock and more like sediment. One population laid over another, then broken, mixed, and laid down again. A people becomes native long enough to forget that it was once new. Which raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If the continent so often presented as ancient, stable, and original was actually built through repeated episodes of migration and replacement, then how many other old identities are really just the surviving names of the last layer left standing? And once you see that pattern, it becomes difficult to contain it inside prehistory. Because this is not only a story about ancient bones, it is a story about how civilizations imagine themselves. For centuries, origin stories have done political work. They have made kingdoms feel ancient nations, feel natural borders, feel inherited. They have implied that a people belongs to a land because it has always been there. But the genomic record coming out of Europe points in a harsher direction. The continent was not built by stillness. It was built by movement, collision absorption, and repeated demographic change. That does not mean archaeology was useless, or that everything once believed was wrong. It means archaeology was trying to reconstruct human movement from shadows, pots, blades, graves, house plans, scattered artifacts. Ancient DNA changed the scale of visibility. It allowed researchers to test whether a cultural shift reflected imitation or migration, whether a new burial custom marked fashion or the arrival of new people. And again across Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe, the answer turned out to be larger and more disruptive than many had expected. In Britain, one later study found that the spread of the Beaker complex was associated with the replacement of roughly 90% of the gene pool within a few hundred years. In Iberia, another found the replacement of about 40% of ancestry and nearly all Y chromosome lineages by around 2000 antes de Cristo. So the deeper lesson is not merely that modern Europeans descend from three major ancestral sources. It is that even identities that feel immovable are often the result of layers laid down by events that were once abrupt, unequal, and probably traumatic. Hunter-gatherers were not simply Europe before Europe. Farmers were not simply Europe becoming civilized. Steppe herders were not simply one more tribe at the edges. Each arrival changed the human substance of the continent. Each one redefined who would later be called native. And that may be the most unsettling part of all, because the science does not reveal a pristine origin hiding beneath the confusion of history. It reveals the opposite. The farther back the record goes, the less purity survives. Modern Europeans, in the broad genetic sense, established by the first major ancient DNA studies, are already a mixture. The old fantasy of an original, untouched European people does not become clearer under the microscope. It dissolves there, which means this discovery was never only about Europe. It exposed a wider historical pattern. Human groups tell stories of permanence because permanence is stabilizing. Science keeps finding motion instead. The names endure, the flags come later, the myths harden. But underneath them, populations shift, merge, disappear, and return under other names. A people can become ancient simply by arriving early enough to forget its own arrival. That is not a metaphor. In Europe, it is now measurable. So the real shock is not that history got one detail wrong. It is that one of the world's most heavily narrated continents turns out to be built on repeated forgetting. Beneath the monuments, beneath the languages, beneath the later empires and nations, there is no single beginning waiting to be recovered. There are only layers of strangers, each one becoming native, each one burying the last, each one certain for a while that the land had always been theirs.